Good evening, everyone, and welcome to St. Peter's, to Nevelson Chapel. My name is Jared Stoller. I am one of the pastors here, and I also serve as a member of the board of the Arts and Architecture Conservancy at St. Peter's. We've been looking forward to this evening discussing the restoration and conservation of Nevelson Chapel. If this is your very first time with us, a very warm welcome to you. If you're returning to this place and you know the various things that happen in this building, you know what an artistic community St. Peter's and Nevelson Chapel support. There are, if you, on your way in, take a look at the corner of 54th Street and Lexington Avenue. There's a sculpture there by Arnaldo Pomodoro. Part of the church's collection includes a work by Kiki Smith, and we're really, really glad that as you came in this morning, or this evening, above us, we saw a body parts bouquet, and the artist, Jack Howard Potter, is with us this night. So thank you, Jack, for joining us. We're also joined by Karen Zukowski, who's the chair of our Arts Committee here of the Nevelson Chapel. The Arts Committee has helped to guide the conservation effort of the chapel. And toward the back is Ed Wagner, who's the chair of the Arts and Architecture Conservancy at St. Peter's. So special thanks to these three for coming, really for all of you for coming. This will be, I think, a really interesting conversation filled with some science, some questions about ethics, some art history. I think it'll be a really wonderful evening, and I hope we'll also have some time for questions and answers. Our two conservators, Jean Dommermuth and Martha Singer, are here. Martha is an objects conservator, and Jean is a paintings conservator, and I can say that we have benefited from both of their expertise. As a way of introduction here, I think of the conservation of the chapel being really broken into three major aspects. The first is the stabilization of the environment, that is to say its HVAC system, its exterior envelope. These items were undertaken in about 2016 with thanks to the National Endowment for the Humanities and a number of other philanthropic efforts, both organizations and people giving to that, is really a major step in the conservation of the chapel. The second element from my perspective is the conservation of the sculpture itself. And the third is the conservation of the environment as a whole. Nevelson didn't simply sculpt the works that hang on the wall, but also that whole environment. This evening is really focused on that second piece of conservation, which is the sculpture. And the chapel is open. We hope people, perhaps on your way in, you had a chance to look at it. On the way out, certainly stop in. And I thought that at the outset, if we're going to delve into the topic of conservation of sculpture, which this is both wood and paint, over the course of the last couple of years, I have learned a lot of new terminology. And I thought maybe it would be helpful at the very beginning to ask our conservators to define a couple of terms. Are you ready for some? Things like delamination, flaking, consolidation, fill, color toning, substrate, all these sorts of things. Can we just turn to you? Can you tell us about some of these terms? And when we have this conversation, what are the technical words we should be thinking about? And if you could give us some definitions.
I would start with how it's made, so you think about it before we destroy it, how it was put together. So I would say that the wood is the substrate, and then there's layers of paint. Sometimes with sculpture, this was one of the questions that came up when we were studying it, was there something between the wood and the paint? There's no barrier. Like sometimes people would put shellac down before they paint. That isn't here on this sculpture. It's wood and then layers of paint.
Can you help us out with some of these other terms?
Delamination.
Like delamination,
that's a
Jean?
good one for her.
So delamination, so if you think of a laminar structure, that there are these different layers of the support and the paint, that what's happening is that those layers are coming apart. So delamination in general can mean that any two layers are actually sort of coming apart. So, and I would then sort of say that delamination in this case is basically the same thing as flaking. So paintings conservators sort of tend to think of when paint pulls away from the support, that is flaking, which I realize like is is slightly a weird term, because you can sort of think of like pastry, like a croissant or something being sort of flaky, and it isn't sort of fact it's sort of in these layers. So when that layer pulls off, it's flaking. If that isn't addressed, then that piece that has lifted off can fall off and become a loss. So that's another term.
And if we're going to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, terms like reconsolidation and terms like fill and tone, could you tell us a little bit about those terms?
Yeah, so consolidation is, it's a glue, but you're not gluing, you could be gluing the paint to the wood, but you could also, a paint is made up of pigment, and then there's a medium or a glue that kind of attaches that pigment to the, so when you consolidate, you're basically putting a glue to it's like cohesive. So that could be one type of consolidation, is that the paint doesn't have enough medium anymore, and so you're holding all those little bits together. Or it could also be re-adhering a paint layer down.
Yeah, so re-adhering that laminar structure. So if it's, sort of essentially relaminating it, right, together.
Is consolidation.
And fill and tone?
So let's say, which happened in the chapel, that some of that paint broke off and got lost, right? So it crumbles away and essentially can't be reattached again. So now you have a loss. So, and in many cases, what that was really that the bare wood was there. There was no paint there. So in, let's say sort of, a general term could be sort of like loss compensation, often happens in two steps. One of them being a fill, which is sort of like a bulky material that makes up the substance of the paint, because any paint like has thickness to it, so it's actually a step down. So like the first thing that you would do would be to fill it, which makes up that gap, and then also create sort of like a base color and a base texture. And then the next thing that you could do would be to tone or in paint on top of that to make that fill match in color with the surrounding area.
All right, we've done our glossary of terms. Everybody ready for this conversation? Here we go. So, Martha and Jean, most of this conversation tonight is going to focus on essentially crisis response. I'm told that every art museum, et cetera, has had some sort of event during COVID-19 and the shutdown, and we certainly had ours. For some folks who have been following this for a while, the conservation, this has been, there have been a number of efforts. There was an effort in the mid-2010s around this HVAC work, an effort undertaken by Sarah Nunberg, which was partially along when we get to COVID and shutdown. And there were some other efforts, we'll say, that take us all the way back to 1977. I'd encourage you all, if you don't know all of the history of that work, to visit nevelsonchapel.org, where you can read about those efforts. Tonight is really talking about this crisis that happened in July of 2020. A number of people were looking at photographs there. These we did not widely distribute at the time, in part because we needed to understand how we were moving forward before we even talked about it. But this crisis really occurs, right, because in July of 2020, very few people are working here, if any, not just at the church, but in all of Citigroup Center. And one day, one of our maintenance individuals noticed water on the doors of the chapel, those glass doors, and you say, well, that's not normal. And he opens it up, and the environment in there was like 90-some% humidity. We had a major humidity spike. Could you describe to folks, people have seen some of the photographs, but from your perspective, what was this crisis? What was, when you walked in and saw, could you take us to that time, July 2020?
Yeah, so I actually received pictures first before I walked in. So I had a preview of it, and I had known about the previous conservation, but these pictures were so wildly different from what the first conservator had to deal with. It was like a new thing. And it was beyond what would normally happen to paint. It was kind of an extreme situation. So I'm an objects conservator, and they called me because these are sculptures, but I felt like it was paint, and paint is really well known by paintings conservators, so I reached out to Jean immediately. We both went to NYU Conservation Center together. We hadn't worked previously together, but she had for years and years worked on just paint, and I felt like that knowledge would be indispensable here. And I wasn't sure, so the humidity had come down by the time we came in, but we weren't sure if this was going to continue, if this was at its peak and it had stopped, because we were we had humidifiers in there, and so the humidity was coming down. We weren't really sure at that point what was happening in the environment or with the artwork. So one thing you do is document so that we can figure out what is happening. So just take a snapshot of what that condition was. And that was really the most important thing to do at that moment, just so we had a gauge, like a way to say, okay, at this point in time, this is what it's looking like. And then we can move on from there to try to figure it out. And then Jean came in also to really do kind of emergency treatment on the paint. If you want to.
Would you say a few words about very early on what you needed to do, emergency treatment or even stabilization, right?
Yeah, so one thing that you typically do when paint is flaking in an emergency situation is that you don't want the paint to flake off and become a loss. So long term, what you want to do is consolidation, is this re-adhering to the substrate. But that takes a little bit of time. And so what people typically do is what would be sort of considered an emergency facing. So a facing meaning another glossary term.
Should have defined that
I'm
earlier.
sorry.
Tell us what it is.
It is essentially temporarily putting a layer on top of that paint to hold it in place until you can do more. And what that facing typically is a long fibered Japanese paper, so like a very thin, long fibered paper, adhered to the surface of the paint with something that you know that you're going to later be able to easily take off, and it won't do any damage. So the idea is it literally is sort of a Band-Aid to hold it together. And so since we knew that in the previous conservator, Sarah Nunberg, had used Fenori, which is an aqueous, a natural water-based adhesive, and she had used this on the paint, so we sort of thought like, okay, that's like the way to go with this temporary stabilization. In trying to do that, and so normally a paint film is a cohesive film. I mean, you can think of it, like a piece of cling film or sort of something like that. It has cohesion in and of itself, and you would just sort of be re-adhering it back down to the substrate. But when we were trying to put on this temporary facing with this adhesive that had been used before, it just totally dissolved in the water. It sort of had absolutely no cohesion. And so we jokingly likened it to marzipan, right? That it was like, which is like something that is not a solid film, right? It's just sort of like stuck together, kind of holds together. But if you put any water on it, it would just sort of fall apart. And this was totally abnormal. I've like worked on lots and lots of different kinds of paint. It has never felt like this before. And so we sort of started to do this and the thought sort of like, whoa, there's something really odd with this paint. Very, very sort of unusual. So, so at that point we sort of thought like, okay, we need to sort of figure out what's going on here.
So the sculpture is, the paint and the wood substrate has been sort of stabilized, and the figuring out of what has gone on here is based, as we move the timeline forward, on your working with it. We're starting to get some experience with it. And then this arts committee, I mentioned that Karen Zukowski is the chair of the arts committee, was coming together. And this is a collection of, do you want to tell us a little bit about who else is on the arts committee? Or the areas of expertise?
So there is a member of the church, David Hottenroth, who is an architect. And he has been involved with lots of projects here at the church. Jim Borstein is an architectural conservator and is on the committee. I have to go around in my head. Kate Lewis, who is head of conservation at Museum of Modern Art. She is both a time-based media conservator and a photo conservator. And Anne Umland, who used to be she's a retired senior curator of contemporary and modern art at Museum of Modern Art as well. Am I missing somebody?
And Karen is a historian, yes.
Karen is a historian. Well, you had mentioned Karen, so I'm sorry, Karen.
So this wonderful collection of people, we start really pretty regular meetings, I think, Karen, almost every other week in some cases. This is a true crisis response to try to find a pathway forward. One of the early ideas is we kind of had some scientific testing from the first the Nürnberg conservation effort, but fairly early on you identified a need for some scientific testing. Can you tell us about that?
The paint was so extreme.
So weird, let's say, so unusual.
So unusual that we were really trying to get a handle on what was happening. And we wanted to understand why it was deteriorating to see if it would help us with the treatment. And also, just so you can understand. Yeah, I'm trying to think about how to say this. It was so unusual. If you don't understand how it's deteriorating, sometimes you can't understand how to conserve it. And so having that knowledge was important to us.
And we had sort of multiple rounds of scientific testing. The earliest scientific testing thought there was some sort of off-gassing. Yeah. Jean, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, so we did a test that basically can identify the different kinds of chemicals that are in this mixture. And one of the things that was found, let's say, one of the ideas about what was found, because with any scientific testing, that's sort of like something that we learned. I'm sorry, this is jumping ahead a little, but sort of something that we learned is that you do the scientific testing and it gives you information that has to be interpreted, and that it was what was found was interpreted to be a chemical called dimethylformamide, which is commonly called DMF, which is what paint stripper is made out of. And the idea which made a lot of sense, was that at least some of the wood in the chapel is plywood. And plywood is actually held together with an adhesive. And that is often an adhesive called urea formaldehyde. And the idea was that in this high humidity event, it had caused that to deteriorate and to give off this dimethylformamide, which, like I said, is paint stripper. So the idea was that it was basically like a self-destructing system in this high humidity environment. So that was sort of the original interpretation of what that was. And so very early on, when we started consolidating the paint, it seemed really advisable to avoid any sort of water. And so we started off using a consolidant that didn't involve water to sort of avoid like making that problem worse.
And it's interesting because we have the benefit of 3 years later looking back at all of this. But then this was really sort of trying to understand truly the understandable in a way. It is not as though the sculpture could speak to us and say, hey, this is what's going on. Mm-hmm. It was very much an effort with scientific testing, but that doesn't really tell you exactly either. And it also, you're working with the paint at this time, Jean, and getting some feedback. What was going on in your mind in this period?
So in this era where we sort of thought like, oh, it's this DMF, and one of the things is that we thought like, well, then this paint is really just going to continue to deteriorate. And, you know, we sort of started thinking like, well, how do you then work with this incredibly deteriorated paint? Can it even be saved? So, you know, but we're sort of, you know, trying to save it and trying to sort of figure this out. But we kind of went on with the idea, and one of the you know, great things about the arts committee was talking about that and sort of talking about the fact that maybe it is always going to be really fragile paint, but let's go ahead and sort of try to consolidate it, you know, saving as much as possible, even sort of given that kind of circumstance. But sort of with this kind of, you know, at that point, sort of thinking like, okay, with this caveat that we want to try to minimize, especially using any water to help make that worse.
So in this period, you actually settle on a consolidant. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well,
and its benefits?
So we started off using a consolidant that is dissolved in ethanol to avoid using any water. And then we sort of thought, well, let's try a few different consolidants.
Actually, it was we were testing consolidants with the scientific people there. So we wanted them to take samples of the glues and look at under a microscope what was happening when we consolidated. So we decided to try a bunch of, and literally the amounts we were testing. It was
literally like the head of a pin.
Yeah, it was like tiny amounts. And so we did a wide range of different glues at that point, basically to see what would work.
And then what we actually found out was that what worked best did have some water in it, and basically it's a gelatin. So it's essentially the same thing that Jell-O is, and it's you know, sort of a collagen-based material. One of the good things about that is that it has like a lot of contractive force, and so when you applied this, it actually sort of like pulled everything back together. And so we sort of thought, okay, we'll try to keep the water to a minimum, but that actually seemed to help in this situation. So that's kind of what we used. And then also because for most of our treatment, for all of our treatment, the chapel was open, and so people, you know, could come and visit. And so you also didn't want to be using anything that had solvents that would be obnoxious to be around for visitors.
Ultimately, we learn something in the scientific testing that we didn't expect. I guess probably now is the time to pull the rabbit out of the hat, right? And you all just published a paper about this and gave a concert,
Yes.
a conference, right?
Yes, so there's a couple things. So early in the scientific testing, one of the things we saw was that when you, so in paint, my eyes used to, as an objects conservator, my eyes used to roll back in my head, but paintings conservators get really excited about this. They take a cross section of all the paints down to the wood, and then they put it in a resin and they look at it under a microscope. And I was always like, oh my gosh. And I kept looking at this cross section because what was next to the wood was thick. And based on the previous scientific research, it should have been basically an alkyd oil paint, oilish paint, I guess I should say, with like a house paint on top. So it should have been a very thin first layer and then another layer. But we kept seeing this thick layer. And I kept thinking the scientists had made a mistake and they had flipped it. Like I was looking at it in the wrong way. So there were all these weird things with the science we couldn't understand. I worked really hard. So Nevelson, before she made the chapel, worked on a piece in Philadelphia, which is really worth visiting, which you may not be able to visit right now during the shutdown, but it's at a federal courthouse in Philadelphia. And it was made a year before she did the chapel. And it's under the government.
Bicentennial Dawn.
Yeah, Bicentennial Dawn. And it's run by the Government Services Agency, basically manages that collection. And I finally got the conservation report from Philadelphia. And
Which had good records because it's from the GSA, so they had these long-term records.
right. And it had been treated in 1983. It had been treated by Nevelson's, she worked with a carpenter to make these works, same carpenter, and then it had been treated by another conservator. And we had all those records, and in that, it turns out they named the paint that was used. And what it revealed was that it was a fire retardant paint. It's called intumescent paint. And the way this works is it's a functional coating. So if you are in a building and a fire happens, paint puffs up. It's called a char. And it protects the substrate, so wood or metal, so that it doesn't burn, and you get about 90 extra minutes to get out of a building. And that's the function of this. And it was used on Bicentennial Dawn, and we think it was used possibly because it's a federal building and it was under different rules. And the carpenter that worked there also helped Nevelson make the chapel here, and we think he just used it again. It was like a lesson learned. But it explained, and I'll let Jean explain it all, it explained all the weird things that we had been running into in the scientific testing.
Yeah, so it had puffed up, which is why it looked thick in the cross sections. And the finding of DMF. So it's interesting because one of the arts committee members, Jim Borstein, and he sort of said, so he's an architectural conservator, so he runs into wood on plywood all the time, and he was super
Skeptical.
He raised questions about this DMF, and he sort of said, that really seems strange, right? So we could kind of question that. And what it turns out is that what had been interpreted, this information had been interpreted incorrectly, and what that DMF actually is a chemical called melamine, which is a component of these fire retardant paints. But since it's such and then also we also did scanning electron microscope, which not only gives you much bigger, more detailed pictures of a cross section, but also can tell you the elements that are in it. And one of the there was a surprisingly large amount of phosphorus in this paint, which is also a component of these fire retardant paints. So all of these kind of weird scientific things were explained by it being this fire retardant paint. Although, had we not actually gotten that explanation from Bicentennial Dawn, it's hard to know if we would have, you kind of needed that hint, right? It was kind of like, just from the inside information, it would have been really difficult to come up with. And then it also, because this is a functional coating, it's not really meant to last a long time. And when it probably puffed up from because they've done, the technology, we've learned a lot about fire retardant paints, is that the technology has changed and it's a little bit difficult to get information about how these paints would have worked in the 1970s. But the ones now, they actually do tests on them for, what happens if it gets wet. And they do, in fact, like deteriorate under a high humidity. So that sort of then explained everything about all of these things that was going on.
So now we realize that we have fire retardant paint below the whole thing, which is a major revelation. It explains the sort of marzipan that you're dealing with. It also helps to understand something that has been perceived but not necessarily explained about layers of paint and why certain layers are behaving differently. With that all in mind, and you also are working with the paint a little bit at a time, and you're working with this gelatin-based consolidant, if we're in your shoes in that moment in time, a pathway forward needs to be found. And there really were multiple pathways. Could you kind of give us the lay of the land? What are the possible way forward with, we chose a way, but I think it's helpful for people to know what are the different options. You're at a real crossroads, at a massive inflection point where you are dramatically taking different steps. What are the possibilities?
Yeah, we had a lot of discussion back and forth about what we wanted to do.
And what is physically possible to do.
Right. So you could, the Philadelphia Bicentennial Dawn, what they did was they stripped it and repainted it because it had been treated in 1983, then it got treated again in the late 90s, and then it got treated twice in the 90s, actually, and then by 2007, they were just like, this just keeps, they didn't have a good environmental control. It was at basically where people were coming into the building, so they had a lot of issues with that work, and so they stripped it and repainted it, which is something that a lot of the Nevelsons get treated that way, whether they're architectural works or sculptural works. Several members of the Arts Committee really appreciate the fact that this is a 50-year-old artwork, and they didn't necessarily want it to look like brand new. And stripping and repainting is not an easy process. For Bicentennial Dawn, it's a much flatter sculpture, and so you have access to it. So much of Frieze of the Apostles, one of the sculptures upstairs, or even Cross of the Resurrections, there's just so many undercuts. And if you wanted to strip and repaint, it's not a simple solution. So I think they all had complications to them. And I think it is a 50-year-old sculpture, and so you want to decide and appreciate it for, yeah.
And the purpose of it, in thinking about sort of like what the actual original purpose was, is that it's meant to be this environment for an experience, for a spiritual experience that you can sort of go in and be surrounded by this and sort of appreciate it on that level, which is kind of different than a sculpture that is in a gallery at MoMA, where what you're going is to go and look at that sculpture. So it has kind of this different purpose, which also then sort of informs the aesthetics that that sort of are prevail kind of in that as well.
I also think that there's a more of an acceptance over time, even since I began conservation to now, which is that we've come to accept that you can't make something static, right? Like everything's going to change over time, and I think people's treatments are coming with that understanding that there's always going to be a change. That's the constant, is that there's a change for everything.
So an option would be to strip the work, repaint it. Another option would...
Another option could be to do what we did, which is kind of minimal, which is just conserve what's there and try to unify the church, the chapel. Another option could also be, there's so many gradations of that. So different consolidants might make it look different, or go back, once we're done, go back and do you want to continue? So the treatment that took place before us was very focused on the aesthetics and to continue, do you want to go there and to continue that treatment as well? So I think there's a wide range, and at the moment we've just kind of slowly, it was an interesting way to do it, which is I think with the arts committee we did it step by step. So we did a step and then everybody came in and we evaluated it, and then we took another little step and then we evaluated that. And so I think it was a very small movement in making our decision.
Another piece of the puzzle is we came in that process to appreciate how the sculpture, which is quite large and it spans multiple walls, each of those component elements have also had different history of conservation elements and were exposed. For example, folks were looking maybe at some photographs in the back. The chapel, the cross of the Good Shepherd, which is the very front of the chapel, probably had a higher humidity element because that's where the HVAC circulates around compared to other parts of the chapel which have less of that. So we came, I think it's fair to say that we came to appreciate in the committee that the sculpture, while it's a unified sculptural whole, is really, there are different, not only are there different elements and perhaps different pieces of wood, et cetera, and different stages of conservation and different pieces of the sculpture, but also the damage was not uniform across the entire sculpture. So the way you might address an instance over here is not the same over there.
Yeah, so I think, it's always a matter of you're treating a part, but you're always thinking about the whole and sort of trying to kind of find a balance and sort of thinking about, which I think is something that the Arts Committee really talked through a lot, is sort of like what's the balance of all of these different pieces. So, yeah.
So take us to the present. Can you tell us a little bit about what has been done so far, where we're at, and then we'll pause there.
I have to think. What has been done so far? So there's one sculpture we haven't touched, which is the
Trinity columns. It's worth saying this if you are interested in controls, right? The Trinity columns were actually on loan to the Farnsworth Museum up in Rockland, Maine, which is Nevelson's sort of adopted childhood hometown when she moved here from Ukraine. And in a perfectly, wonderfully environmentally controlled environment that has been like that for forever. So the columns, in a way, are our control. They were brought back after this. We're very pleased with those.
We are. So each sculpture has had a series of treatments which has dealt with the strongest visual issues. So a lot of all the lifting paint we've set back down. We have dealt with filling. The fill, do you want to talk about the fill since it's your
Yeah,
baby?
I sort of said at the beginning that like this loss compensation usually happens in two steps, doing a fill, and that sort of is the base, like a base color and texture, and makes up the level difference. And then you often then come back around and do in painting. It is sort of well known and well kind of understood is that probably the hardest thing to fill in paint is matte white paint, because it like getting the white perfectly right and then also getting the gloss and everything like sort of absolutely, it's really, really difficult to make it absolutely invisible. It's also true that there's a lot of color and texture variation in on the surfaces of the sculptures, and that may be addressed. That may be sort of one of the things that is addressed in the future. So to kind of, let's say, do something so that the losses weren't obvious and weren't jarring, but to kind of give some wiggle room for the future, what we basically did is made up a toned fill. So this is a little bit of a mixture of the fill and the in painting. So created a fill that was basically a base, a sort of average of the colors of in the room, and sort of the right kind of texture and gloss, and mixed that up and sort of put that sort of in the losses. So if you go and look carefully, and we actually had paintings conservators from MoMA come and visit, and this sort of one of the grand old ladies of conservation sort of said, "Oh, but see, I can see this here." So you can see it. You can absolutely see our toned fills. But on the other hand, the goal was that you can actually go there, and in this environment of this is, you know, a place for contemplation, a sort of quiet oasis for, you know, a quiet moment, and not be distracted by that. So and that's sort of where maybe that's enough, or maybe we sort of go further and try to make it a little bit more invisible.
And then there were also some losses, some actual pieces were missing on the Frieze of the Apostle, which we had made and reattached.
Based on photographs.
Based on photographs, yep.
And there also some instances, very few fortunately, where the wood itself had cracked, and you filled those as well.
Yeah, so the wood is in excellent condition. I mean, that's one of the things that's really, I wasn't expecting. Like trying to take it all in when I first started, we kept it, that was one of our assumptions, is we kept assuming the damage was from the expansion and contraction of wood from heat, from humidity, and that wasn't an issue at all. It's high grade furniture plywood, some of the, especially the circular pieces, and those seem to have sailed through. I mean, the wood is in very good condition. There's almost no problems with the wood in there.
Yeah, and there was one place that you filled that was actually a crack in the wood, and you filled.
I did, but it's like so.
Yeah.
It's like I don't even know. It has to be a single percent of like it's like a fraction of a percent of the wood in there. It's in very, very good condition.
I think that's one of the things that I came to appreciate in this process so far is, you know, if you go in there, you count the number of layers of wood that have been put together to, for example, create the cross of the Good Shepherd in the front. It's like 13, 14 layers deep. And then you also have this dramatic, the sky vestment with massive surfaces where there's nothing but paint. Mm-hmm. This must drive you crazy.
Well, what is true is that each sculpture, and you really pointed this out about how like it really sort of represents sort of all of the different types of work that she did, but they each kind of very much have their own character. And that's sort of like another aspect of working on this, is that you have to sort of think like, okay, well, this has this vast expanse of paint. What does that need, as opposed to having like lots of, like the Frieze of the Apostles, which has lots of layers of relatively thin paint, or thin
Wood.
like smaller pieces of wood. So they may need different things aesthetically, and different things may sort of like pop out at you aesthetically. So you have to kind of bear that in mind.
You've walked us through pretty much to today. We could probably go very deep into some of these topics. You've written at least one paper. You have multiple papers, I think. I think the folks who did the science have also written some papers. And if they aren't up on nevelsonchapel.org, they'll be up there soon. So if you're interested in delving into some of these subjects a little bit more deeply, there are resources for doing that. I'm curious if you could step back, and Martha, you were the first person we called. When you got this telephone call, I'm curious what went through your mind.
It's kind of like a fascination with a train wreck, I think. I think it's both like repelling and fascinating at the same time, right? Because I saw for me it was visual. So I saw when you called me.
Do we FaceTime? I think we might have FaceTimed.
You may have.
I'm trying to think, Karen, if we.
Hannah sent me pictures, so I got pictures of what it looked like, and it was it was extreme, which is why I called Jean in terms of paint.
Yeah, there was no possibility of us getting together. There were no vaccines available. The idea of coming in person never crossed anyone's mind. We were doing this entirely remotely.
Yeah. We did eventually come in though, and then we all spread out in the chapel, like at like the as far away
as far as we could
from each other. It was. It clearly needed help, and so I just figured, we'd take it one step at a time because we'd first do that emergency stabilization, and then we'd stop and think about what to do. That's kind of what ran through my mind.
And Jean, for you, because your friend Martha calls you up and says, "Hey, there's a disaster. Would you come join me?"
Yeah, I don't remember seeing the pictures before coming. And so, like, when you look at these pictures that are in the binders and you see how alarming it is, and you sort of came in and thought, oh my God, and I think it's also because, like, at that moment, everything just sort of seemed so like, oh my God, what's going on? What are we possibly going to do? So it was sort of there was a little bit of a feeling of sort of it being overwhelming, but I think it's also always true. I think, like, conservators are both fascinated with the train wreck and always also want to put things back into order, and also sort of this feeling of, knowing how important this is to this community, to the city, it was really interesting, working in the chapel and having it being open as we were working. And we had all sorts of visitors who would come in. We had sort of had our regulars who would, come in for their, daily kind of moment. We had people come from all over the world, who were sort of making this pilgrimage to come and see it. So, I think, you sort of understood that importance of this and sort of this feeling of, well, we have to get this back into order in some way. Like, we don't quite know how we're going to do that, but.
It was a long multi-year process, and done out in the open. Anybody could come in the whole time, at least once the church reopened after COVID.
Right. Yep.
I'm curious. This has been not only a long process, an intense process. How has it been similar to other conservation efforts you've undertaken, and how has it been different?
I think the similarity is that there's always sort of this process of that you come in, you do an examination, you try to figure out what the problem is, you try to figure out a solution, and then you sort of work through that solution. And that's sort of, always the case. It's just that most of the time that it's a little bit more obvious what the problem is and what the solution is going to be, and it's a little bit more straightforward. So that's kind of the similarity.
The difference is working with an arts committee with such a varied background, and having all that expertise there to talk about it and make a decision together. The slowness of the process. So first we had to do the insurance claim, then we had to wait for the insurance money, then we had scientific testing. It just was a very slow process. And even moving forward, even once the insurance money had come, we moved pretty slowly. And I have really grown to appreciate that slowness of working. It gave us time we would work and then we'd present to the art committee, but that actually, in having to pull those ideas together and explain what we were doing, it actually gave us time to process what we were doing and then get feedback and then move forward again. I just found that really important, to the point where I'm wanting to do it again in other projects that I'm doing, because it was such a great way to think about what we were doing and self-correct as we were going along.
Any ways in which this was different for you, Jean?
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of, what Martha said about the, I think that the time aspect was really kind of important. I mean, it was from the moment that this happened until we first started doing some actual treatment was 2.5 years. And it really sort of like emphasized the fact that this, and I think sort of this, entity is thinking in the long term, right? And a lot of the things that we work on are, it needs to be done for a loan that's happening in 2 months, or a sale that's happening, in a month. And sort of people are thinking on a much sort of smaller, shorter time frame. And so I think that kind of gave you kind of a different feel about not exactly the permanence, but sort of like the lifetime of this as a work. And yet, like you could sort of imagine Louise Nevelson sort of like at the time. I think also she is sort of very present. I mean, I think all of and there are multiple personalities who are very present in this whole work, and I think it's partially because of the institutional memory here and the way people sort of talk about those people. That it makes it sort of very personal between you and that artist. So,
What's next for the chapel? Where you've taken us to the present, what are we waiting on? What are the questions that are before us? What can folks expect over the course of the next several years?
I don't think you're going to see big changes now. I think things are going to slowly and be much more subtle, aesthetic changes.
Yeah, so there still are a lot of issues with, and if you sort of want to like, if you point them out, if I point them out, then it becomes really obvious.
Then you see them,
then
right?
you see them. But there are, let's say, color and texture variations across the different pieces. Some things we understand why, some things we don't. And it has been sort of an ongoing discussion with the Arts Committee, and I think, Will, about how much of that is acceptable and how much should maybe sort of try to be tweaked a little bit, and we kind of understand ways that we can do that a little bit. But in a way, with this sort of massive damage, it also always happens that, like, if you have like a big damage and you fix that big damage, now you see other smaller things, and that is sort of always going to happen. So with this big damage, you couldn't really sort of see that, and now that comes back into focus a little bit. But there is, sort of also this idea that it's a 50-year-old work, and it probably shouldn't look brand new, and it can't really look brand new. So maybe how much variation is okay.
I would say that one of the things, at least I know, that I've learned in this process is that it's never really complete. this is an ongoing journey. We're responsible for it for a period of time. We're hoping to pass on to another generation more documentation, more knowledge about at least what we've come to learn. But also, I feel like the slowness of these last couple of years is actually something that one would want to embrace for this sculpture for, say, the next 50 years. You really want to slow time down.
Yes, I also think that it's kind of like a house, like things need maintenance and just slow changes are going to happen. And we'll just need to be taken care of. There will be dust and it will need to be dusted.
There'll be dust. It's a very dirty city. So, I mean, there's sort of that aspect of it. And then also, so the aspect that everything changes over time. So, paint changes. It changes chemically. It changes its color and gloss sort of over time. So, there's always sort of that kind of.
Yes.
Karen, question or comment, please. Could we give you a microphone?
So I think these these two wonderful ladies are selling themselves short just a little bit. They're kind of saying that everything all came together when we discovered the chemical composition of this intumescent paint. But in fact, for a year prior to that, they had been diligently at work figuring out a treatment system that was going to work. And by the time, and the Arts Committee was meeting all this time, so that was an example of their craft that they were doing, and doing it superbly. So that by the time that we discovered all of the chemistry, that was like kind of everything clicking in our heads about why the treatment that they had come to with their hands and their brains was working properly.
I also think, Karen, though, your leadership has been really fabulous in terms of the Arts Committee and questions you ask us and challenge us to think. And it's been a really important back and forth to have that teamwork and group and the group of people you pull together as well.
What's the most important question? What is white?
What is white? Yeah. This has been a marvelously rich conversation. Thank you all for coming to be part of it. We can continue the conversation afterwards. And a special thanks to the two of you. I told you what my last question would be, and so we've come to that point. And so I'm truly curious about this. What is the most significant thing you learned in this process for yourself and for your craft? You both are. You didn't come into this, you come into as really as experts in your fields, and yet this journey has enriched us all. So I'm curious how it has enriched the two of you.
You first.
Oh, I'll go first. So, this turned out to be something that we really didn't expect. Just in the way that we didn't expect the pandemic, we didn't expect the HVAC system to go crazy, but we also weren't expecting it to be this really unusual paint that, truthfully, no one has ever published on anybody, any artist using this before. So it's a little bit sort of to expect the unexpected, or at least to be open to something not being what you expect, right? To not just sort of go a little bit kind of on autopilot, but always to kind of be open to those kind of questions. And I do really think that the arts committee sort of helped us with that, because I think oftentimes conservators tend to be very focused on the details and sort of thinking like, oh, I know what this is. I can kind of, focus on this kind of thing. And you need to sort of look at the wider picture and sort of say what actually kind of what does or doesn't actually sort of make sense here, and maybe it's something that I hadn't thought of at all.
Yeah, I think I had maybe an unrealistic. I'm married to a scientist, so I'm kind of embarrassed to say this, but I think I had an unrealistic expectation of the science. Like, I expected it to be more black or white, and I don't think I understood the nuance of the science. That was one thing that I have definitely carried forward, that if somebody tells me it's X, it may not be X. And then the other thing is also, as I said before, the pacing of this has just been so important. I have really valued the slow movement and the discussion and the time to stop and think and just incorporate that has been really important.
We're very grateful for the two of you, both for your work and for sharing this. We give them a round of applause, please. Thank you. And please stay for some conversation and some refreshments. Thank you again for being with us this night.